The garage door was already up when I pulled into the driveway, and that was the first thing wrong, though I didn't understand it as wrong yet, just strange, a small detail out of place, the kind of thing you register and set aside because your mind is already 3 steps ahead of you. My name is Brayden. I'm 36, and I fly more weeks than I don't, running territory sales for a medical equipment company across 4 states, which meant that on any given Tuesday there was maybe a coin flip chance I'd be sleeping in my own bed or a Marriott somewhere in Wyoming. That Tuesday, the flight out of Denver had been canceled twice, mechanical, then weather, and by 6 p.m. I'd given up on making the client dinner in Cheyenne at all and driven home instead, 40 minutes with nothing on the radio, thinking about nothing more complicated than how good it would feel to surprise Camille and Ella a full day early. I came in through the back door instead of the front, out of habit more than anything. The garage entry put me straight into the mudroom, 2 steps from the kitchen, and I remember already smiling, already composing the small joke I'd make about the cancelled flight being the best thing to happen to me all week. The house was quiet in a way that didn't immediately register as unusual. Ella's shoes weren't by the door, which meant she was probably still at my mother-in-law's, where she went 2 afternoons a week while Camille worked her hospital shifts. I called out anyway, some version of "Hey, it's just me," and got no answer, and started up the stairs assuming Camille was in the shower, still not thinking anything at all, still holding on to the small warm feeling of a surprise that was about to go exactly the way I'd hoped. The bedroom door was half open. I want to be precise about this, because precision is the only thing that stayed steady in my memory of that moment. Half open, not closed, not wide open either, just enough that I could see movement inside before I understood what the movement was. I stood in the hallway for maybe 2 full seconds before anything in my brain assembled the pieces into something I could name. Camille. Someone who wasn't me. Our bed, the one we'd bought together 4 years earlier when we moved into this house, the one Ella still climbed into some mornings for cartoons before either of us was fully awake. I didn't say anything at first. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. There was a stretch of time, I don't know exactly how long, where I simply stood there, not moving, not speaking, my whole body gone strangely cold and distant, like I was watching something happen to someone else's life through a window I'd wandered up to by accident. Then Camille saw me. I have relived the sound she made 1,000 times since, and I still don't have a word for it. Not quite a scream, not quite my name, something caught in the narrow space between both. And then everything after that happened too fast and too loud all at once, a blur of motion and noise that I can only reconstruct now in fragments. Derek, our neighbor, a man I had waved to across our shared fence line more times than I could count, a man whose kid played with Ella at the same park most Saturdays, scrambling backward off the bed, saying my name like it was an apology and an excuse in the same breath. Camille pulling the sheet against herself, saying, "Brayden, wait, let me explain," in a voice that came out high and cracked and useless against what I'd already seen with my own eyes. I didn't wait. I want you to understand that whatever composure I'd walked into that house with was already gone by the time I found my own voice, and what came out of me wasn't a question. It was something closer to a roar, formed out of 4 words I don't remember choosing. Get out of my house. Derek didn't argue. He grabbed his clothes off the floor in an armful, not bothering to dress, and moved past me in the doorway with his eyes down, and some part of me, some part still capable of noticing small details even in the middle of the worst moment of my life, registered that his hands were shaking as badly as mine were. I didn't know it yet, standing in that hallway with my whole life rearranging itself in real time, that what I just walked in on wasn't the beginning of the story at all. It was the middle of something that had already been happening, quietly, for months, in the very house I'd been paying a mortgage on, sleeping 4 nights a week away from, trusting completely the entire time. Camille and I had built something I genuinely believed was solid. We'd met 7 years earlier at a hospital fundraiser I'd attended for work, both of us standing near the same dessert table out of the shared, unspoken understanding that neither of us knew anyone else in the room. She'd made a joke about the shrimp cocktail being the only honest thing at the event, and I'd laughed harder than the joke deserved because something about her directness landed differently than most people did. She was steady in a way I found myself leaning on almost immediately, an ICU nurse, someone who'd seen enough real crisis in her professional life to have very little patience for manufactured drama in her personal one. I loved that about her. I built a lot of my own sense of stability around the fact that she never seemed to need much reassurance, never seemed rattled by the demands of my travel schedule the way some partners might have been. I understand now, standing in that hallway with the whole architecture of my marriage collapsing in real time, that I had mistaken her not needing reassurance for her not needing anything from me at all, and that somewhere in the 4 years since we bought this house, that mistake had quietly, steadily, cost us both more than I'd ever let myself notice. "Brayden," Camille said again, standing now, wrapped in the sheet, her whole body shaking. "Please! Just let me explain. Please don't just stand there." I didn't answer her. I turned around and walked back down the stairs, out the same back door I'd come in through 15 minutes earlier, believing my flight cancellation was the luckiest break of my week, and I sat in my car in the driveway with both hands gripping the steering wheel, not driving anywhere, just sitting there shaking, staring at the garage door I'd noticed was already up the moment I pulled in. A detail that had meant nothing to me then and meant everything to me now, because I understood, with a sickening clarity, that it had probably been up because Derek's car had been in our driveway not long before mine had. I didn't know it yet, but the fight that was about to happen inside that house over the following hour was going to be louder, and uglier, and more revealing than anything either of us had said to each other in 7 years of marriage, and neither of us was walking away from it the same person we'd been when I'd pulled into that driveway. Brayden and Camille built a life that ran, from the outside, on a rhythm most people would call functional, a demanding travel schedule for him, brutal rotating shifts for her, a 4-year-old who somehow thrived in the gaps between both. We had a house in a quiet cul-de-sac in the Highlands, a neighbor 2 doors down we'd befriended almost immediately after moving in, a marriage that, by any external measure, looked like it was managing the hardest parts of adult life reasonably well. Looking back now, I think the first thing I should have noticed happened almost a year before that Tuesday in the hallway, in a stretch of months I remember mostly as a blur of hotel rooms and rental cars. My travel had ramped up that year. A territory expansion at work meant I was gone 4, sometimes 5 nights a week instead of the usual 3, and I remember feeling genuinely proud of the promotion that came with it, genuinely certain that the extra income was worth the extra distance. I told myself Camille understood, because she never complained, and I mistook her silence for agreement instead of examining what it might actually have meant. Derek and his wife Priya had moved in 2 doors down about 18 months before any of this, and for the first year they were simply the ordinary texture of a good cul-de-sac: barbecues, borrowed tools, kids running between yards. I like Derek. I want to be honest about that, because it matters for understanding how blindsided I actually was. We'd coached the same rec league soccer team the previous fall. I had genuinely, uncomplicatedly considered him a friend. There was a stretch that spring, maybe 8 months before the hallway, when Priya took a temporary work assignment out of state for 3 months, leaving Derek home alone most weekdays with his own son. I remember thinking, at the time, that it made sense for Camille and Derek to lean on each other more during that stretch, single parenting adjacent, both of them managing kid pickups and dinners without a spouse physically present most nights. I thought it was a good thing, honestly, a sign of a strong neighborhood, 2 families supporting each other through a hard season. I didn't examine why. Supporting each other started meaning dinners at our house on nights I was traveling, just the 2 of them and the kids, more often than seemed purely coincidental. I told myself it was practical. I didn't ask myself why practical kept happening at exactly the same frequency as my longest trips. Ella mentioned Derek's name a lot that spring, more than seemed proportional to a neighbor, though I didn't clock it the way I would clock it later, replaying every dinner conversation from that stretch with a completely different lens. Derek made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, she told me once over video call from a hotel room in Salt Lake City, and I remember laughing, genuinely delighted, thinking what a nice thing it was that our daughter had an extra adult in her life who cared enough to make dinosaur pancakes on an ordinary Wednesday. I didn't think about it again for weeks. I should have. That was the first thread, and I let it go slack in my hands without ever registering I was holding it at all. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever looked back at a stretch of your own life and realized the version of events you were telling yourself at the time and the version that was actually happening were two entirely different stories running in parallel, you already know how strange that particular vertigo feels. Not painful yet, not at first, just a low, persistent wrongness you can't quite locate the source of. That was the moment I should have followed. I let it go instead, because the call dropped and Ella's attention moved to something else the way a 4-year-old's attention always does, and by the time I thought about the dinosaur pancakes again, months had already passed. Priya's assignment ended that summer, and she came home, and I remember feeling relieved on some vague, unexamined level, without understanding exactly what I was relieved about. The dinners at our house stopped being quite so frequent. What I didn't know, and wouldn't understand for a long time, was that whatever had started during those 3 months hadn't stopped along with the dinners. It had simply gotten better at hiding. That fall, Camille's shifts at the hospital shifted to a new rotation that had her working more nights, and my own travel schedule stayed brutal through the holidays and into the new year. We started passing each other in doorways more than actually being in the house together. A kiss on the way out, a list of things the other one needed to know, the two of us running our household like a well-managed relay race instead of a marriage. I want to be fair to that season, because in a lot of ways it was simply what our life demanded of us. But I understand now that I mistook the smooth handoffs for closeness, when really we'd stopped actually talking about anything beneath the logistics months before I ever noticed the silence. There was a night in November when I came home from a 4-day trip and Camille seemed distracted in a way that didn't match anything on the surface of our conversation, distant during dinner, quieter than usual putting Ella to bed, and then, once Ella was asleep, unusually affectionate with me on the couch, almost deliberately so, in a way that felt, at the time, like a genuinely welcome homecoming. Something small and unfamiliar moved through me that night, a flicker I couldn't name and didn't examine. I told myself it was just how much she missed me. I was getting good, by then, at explaining things away before I'd even fully registered feeling them. The next real sign came from Priya, of all people, who mentioned to me at a neighborhood gathering in December, entirely without suspicion, that Derek had seemed off that fall, distracted, working late more often than his job usually required. Marriage stuff, probably, she said, laughing it off, not understanding what she was actually handing me months before I'd have any context to understand it myself. You know how it goes some years. I nodded along, made some agreeable comment about long winters being hard on everyone, and didn't think about it again until much later, when that comment would resurface in my memory with an entirely different weight attached to it. I want to be honest about my own part in what follows, because it would be too easy to tell this story as though I were simply an unlucky bystander to someone else's decisions. I wasn't, not entirely. I have always been a person who throws himself into work when things at home feel uncertain, not because I don't care about home, but because work has always been the one place I know exactly how to succeed, exactly what the metrics are, exactly how to measure whether I'm doing well. When something felt slightly off in my marriage that year, and looking back, plenty did, my instinct was never to slow down and ask the hard question. My instinct was to take on another territory, book another trip, tell myself that providing more was the same thing as being present more. It wasn't. I understand that now in a way I couldn't have let myself understand it then. I told myself the extra travel was for our family. I understand now it was also, in its own way, an escape from a marriage I'd stopped knowing how to actually be inside of, and calling it provision let me avoid ever naming that. There was one more sign that winter, smaller than the others, whose true size I only understood much later. Camille started keeping her phone on her at all times, even in the bathroom, even during the 2 hours a week she used to leave it charging in the kitchen while she took a bath. It was a small enough change that I noticed it only the way you notice a picture frame moved slightly on a wall. Not wrong exactly, just not quite where it used to be. By February, I had accumulated enough of these small, individually dismissible moments that some part of my brain had already built a shape out of them, even though I refused, consciously, to look directly at what that shape was. The dinosaur pancakes. Priya's offhand comment about Derek being distracted. The phone that never left Camille's side anymore. None of it, on its own, meant anything. All of it, together, was already the outline of something I didn't yet have the courage, or, honestly, the suspicion, to name. I didn't know it then, standing in my own kitchen most mornings drinking coffee before another flight, that the man I'd coached soccer with the previous fall was already, quietly, becoming the second most important adult in my daughter's life, and that the marriage I believed was simply strained by distance had already, months earlier, crossed into something I wouldn't understand the full shape of until the day my flight got cancelled. I want to be honest about something before I continue this account. For a long time, I didn't actually suspect anything specific. What I had, through that winter and into early spring, wasn't suspicion so much as a low, persistent unease I kept explaining away with whatever reasonable story was closest at hand. Exhaustion, my own travel schedule, the ordinary strain of raising a small kid on two demanding careers. The first moment that actually cracked that unease into something sharper happened in March, about 6 weeks before the hallway. I was home for a rare full week, no travel, and Ella asked me at breakfast, entirely without any weight behind it, whether Derek was coming over again that day. Again? I asked, more curious than alarmed. Has he been coming over a lot? He comes on Tuesdays, Ella said, matter-of-fact, buttering her toast with the intense concentration of a 4-year-old. When you're at the airport. I remember the specific, precise way that sentence landed. When you're at the airport, not sometimes, not once in a while, a schedule, articulated by a child with no reason to be inventing one. I asked Camille about it that evening, casually, over dishes, and she said Derek dropped by occasionally to help with things around the house, a leaky faucet, moving something heavy, the kind of practical neighborly help that made perfect sense on its own. I remember believing her, or telling myself I did, and I understand now those had already become two separate things by that point, wearing the same words. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever heard your own small child describe a pattern in your spouse's life that you had no idea existed, spoken with the flat, unguarded honesty only a 4-year-old is capable of, you know that particular kind of quiet doesn't leave you right away. It sits in your chest for days, resurfacing at odd moments, a low hum underneath everything else you're doing. I didn't push further that night. I told myself Camille's explanation was reasonable, that I was reading too much into a leaky faucet and a helpful neighbor, and I let the conversation move on the way conversations do when you're not ready yet for where the next question might lead. The following week I noticed something else, small, easily dismissible on its own, but it landed differently against everything else I was already quietly carrying. Camille had started going for early morning runs, something she'd never done before in the 7 years I'd known her, always up and out before Ella woke, back within 45 minutes, hair damp, energized in a way that felt, at the time, like a genuinely positive new habit I should have been encouraging rather than questioning. I didn't ask why a woman who told me for years she hated running had suddenly taken it up with this much enthusiasm. Not because I hadn't noticed the change. Because some part of me had already decided that asking would mean admitting I needed an answer, and I still wasn't ready to need one. I called Priya on an unrelated pretext in early April, something about coordinating a joint birthday party for the kids, and near the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, I asked how things were going with Derek, whether the off mood she'd mentioned in December had lifted. There was a pause on the line, longer than the question warranted. He's been better lately, actually, she said. Honestly, I think whatever it was passed. Why do you ask? I told her it was nothing, just making conversation, and hung up feeling worse than I had before the call, though I couldn't yet articulate exactly why. Something about the specific timing of Derek's improved mood, landing right around the same window as Camille's new running habit and Ella's Tuesday schedule, had started to assemble itself into a shape in my mind that I still wasn't ready to name out loud, even to myself. Looking back now, I think that phone call was the actual turning point, not because Priya said anything incriminating, but because it was the first moment I let myself actively go looking for a pattern instead of waiting for one to present itself to me. I started paying closer attention after that, in ways I'm not proud of but also don't regret, given what I now understand was actually happening. I noticed that Camille's shift schedule, which I'd always simply trusted without cross-referencing, had her working what she described as unusually long stretches some weeks. Stretches that, when I quietly checked against the hospital's public shift board one afternoon out of a curiosity I still hadn't fully admitted to myself, didn't quite match what she told me. I didn't confront her about any of it. I want to explain why, because I think it matters for understanding who I actually am in this story, and it isn't entirely flattering. I was afraid, not of a specific truth yet, because I still didn't have one, but of what it would mean about the last 7 years if the vague unease I was carrying turned out to be founded on something real. I told myself I needed more information before I said anything, the same way I tell a sales team not to make a pitch before they'd actually confirmed the client's budget. I understand now that this instinct, useful in my professional life, had become a kind of cover in my personal one, a reason to keep gathering instead of ever having to actually ask. There was a night in late April, about 2 weeks before the hallway, when I came home from a short trip a day early, the first time, though I didn't understand the significance of it then, and found Camille in an unusually good mood, warm and affectionate in a way that felt, at the time, like exactly the homecoming I wanted. It was only much later, putting the timeline together, that I understood that day had been a Tuesday, and that whatever good mood I'd walked into that evening likely had very little to do with missing me. Something in me noticed the disconnect even then, a flicker I still didn't let myself examine directly. I was getting very good, by that point in the spring, at feeling something was wrong and immediately talking myself out of investigating why. I want to pause the account here, because I didn't know it yet, but Camille's own side of that same spring carried its own separate, private unraveling, one I only understood the shape of much later, in her own words. I remember the week Ella asked Brayden about Derek coming over on Tuesdays, and I spent 3 days after that terrified he was going to ask me something I couldn't answer honestly. He didn't push. I remember feeling this awful, twisted relief when he let it go, relief that made me feel sicker than if he'd actually confronted me, because it meant I got to keep going, and some part of me had been hoping, without admitting it to myself, that he'd force it to stop before I had to be the one to end it. That's what she told me, eventually. I knew none of it at the time. I only knew that the specific quality of my own unease had started, by early May, to feel less like vague anxiety and more like a fact I hadn't yet been given the words for. By the first week of May, I had decided, without fully articulating it even to myself, that I needed to actually confirm what I suspected before I said anything to Camille directly. I told myself I was being careful, methodical, not wanting to accuse her of something I couldn't prove. Looking back, I think some part of me was also simply not ready yet. Some part of me still wanted, badly, for there to be an innocent explanation waiting on the other side of whatever I eventually found. I didn't get the chance to find it methodically. 6 days later, my flight to Cheyenne was canceled twice in one afternoon, and instead of spending one more night in a hotel room I never planned to sleep in, I drove home instead, and walked, entirely by accident, into the exact truth I'd spent 2 months circling without ever quite letting myself name. There isn't a part 4 in the way this story usually has one. I didn't get weeks of careful documentation, didn't get to build a folder methodically the way a more patient version of this story might have unfolded. What I got instead was 15 minutes, the drive from the airport to my own driveway, the walk from the garage through the mudroom, up the stairs, to a half-open bedroom door, and then the entire slow architecture of suspicion I'd been building for 2 months collapsed all at once into something I no longer had to prove, because I'd seen it with my own eyes. I want to go back and fill in what I understand now, having pieced it together in the weeks after, because the truth turned out to be both simpler and worse than the vague shape I'd been circling. It had started, as best I can reconstruct it, during the 3 months Priya was away the previous spring. Not immediately, not with any grand decision, but slowly, the way these things apparently always seem to start. Camille told me, much later, that the first time anything happened between them wasn't planned at all. A night Derek came over to help fix something in the garage, both of them exhausted from solo parenting their respective kids through a long week, a bottle of wine between them that had felt, in the moment, like nothing more than two tired friends decompressing. I didn't think of it as the beginning of anything that first night. I told myself it was a one-time lapse, something that happened because we were both worn down, and it would never happen again. I believed that, for about 11 days. That's what she told me, eventually, about the actual start of it, a piece of the timeline I only had access to after everything had already broken open in the hallway. What I want to focus on here, though, is what happened in the minutes and hours immediately after I walked in, because that's the part of this story that actually earns the word proof, not documents or screenshots, but the raw, undeniable fact of what I'd witnessed with my own eyes, followed by everything that came pouring out once either of us could pretend anymore. I sat in my car in the driveway for maybe 10 minutes after Derek left, shaking, staring at nothing, before I went back inside. Camille was dressed by then, sitting on the edge of the bed, our bed, with her face in her hands, and when I walked back into the bedroom she looked up at me with an expression I'd never once seen on her face in 7 years of marriage, total, undefended terror. "Don't," I said before she could start whatever sentence she was gathering herself to say. "Don't tell me it's not what it looked like. I saw exactly what it looked like." "I wasn't going to say that," she said, her voice already breaking. "I don't have anything to say that makes this better. I need you to actually let me talk, Brayden. I need you to not just walk away from this like you did downstairs." I want to be honest that in that moment, I didn't want to talk. Every part of my body was still running on the same chemical flood that had carried me down the stairs and out the back door 15 minutes earlier, and what I actually wanted, more than an explanation, was to put my fist through something. I didn't. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, hands shaking at my sides, and I made myself stay long enough to hear whatever she was about to say, even though every instinct in me was screaming to leave. I didn't think about what I was about to hear. I only thought, I need to know how long, because not knowing is its own kind of unbearable. "How long?" I said. Not a question, exactly. More like the only two words I had left in me that could organize the size of what I needed to know. She told me. 9 months since the spring Priya was away. Every Tuesday, most weeks, timed to my longest trips. I stood there absorbing each new fact like a physical blow, and something in my chest that had been holding very still since the hallway finally gave way entirely. 9 months, I said, and I could hear my own voice rising, couldn't stop it even as I registered it happening. 9 months, in my house, in our bed, while I was flying across 4 states trying to build something for this family, and the whole time you were. I couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. We both already knew exactly what the end of it was. "I know," she said, crying now openly. "I know exactly what I did, Brayden, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend there's a version of this that isn't as bad as it looks, because there isn't. But you don't get to act like you don't have any part in why I was so lonely in this marriage that I let myself start something with the neighbor." Something in me detonated at that. I want to be honest about this, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering in an account like this one. I didn't stay calm. I didn't manage this the way some more composed version of myself might have. "Are you actually blaming me right now?" I said, and my voice had gone somewhere I didn't recognize, loud enough that I registered, distantly, that the neighbors on the other side of us could probably hear every word through the walls. "You cheated on me with a man I coached soccer with. In my own bed. And you want to talk about my travel schedule? I'm not saying it excuses it," she shouted back, standing up now too, the two of us facing each other across a bedroom that 15 minutes earlier had held the worst thing I'd ever witnessed in my own house. "I'm saying you don't get to act shocked that something was wrong in this marriage when you've been checked out of it for 2 years, Brayden. You think I don't notice when you'd rather be on a plane than home with us? You think I haven't noticed for years?" "So that's your answer," I said, and I could feel myself pacing now, unable to hold still, the same restless energy I'd normally burn off running or lifting something heavy at the gym, except there was nowhere for it to go except straight into this fight. 2 years of feeling neglected means you sleep with Derek. That's the math you did. I never said it was fair math," she screamed, and something in her voice cracked entirely open. years of something clearly unresolved between us surfacing all at once, dragged up alongside the affair itself. You want to talk about fair? You missed my father's memorial dinner for a client trip, Brayden. You missed it. I sat there alone with my mother because you decided a account renewal mattered more than being there for me, and I never once said anything about it because I didn't want to be the wife who complains about her husband's job. I just started disappearing into this marriage a little more every single week instead. Don't you dare turn this into something I did to you, I said, and I heard my own voice crack for the first time, the anger finally cutting into something raw underneath it. Don't you dare stand there and make what you did sound like something I earned. We went back and forth like that for what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 20 minutes. Old grievances I didn't even know she'd been carrying surfacing alongside the fresh, raw wound of what I'd walked in on, both of us saying things neither of us would be able to fully take back. I told her things about how alone my own travel schedule made me feel too, nights in hotel rooms wondering if she even noticed I was gone. And some part of me understood, even in the middle of screaming it, that I was admitting my own failures in real time, in the worst possible way, in the middle of the worst fight of our marriage. It stopped, finally, not because either of us ran out of things to say, but because we both heard, at the exact same moment, the sound of my mother-in-law's car pulling into the driveway, bringing Ella home early because she'd had a stomachache at their house, and we both went silent at once, the way you go silent when you remember, suddenly and completely, that there's a 4-year-old about to walk through the front door directly into whatever this had become. I didn't know it yet, standing in that abruptly silent bedroom with my chest still heaving, that the fight wasn't actually over. It had only paused, and what came next, once Ella was asleep that night, was going to be the conversation that finally, completely ended my marriage. Ella went to bed around 8. Oblivious to anything except the fact that her stomachache had mostly passed and she wanted an extra story, which I read to her in a voice I fought to keep steady, sitting on the edge of her bed in a house that had entirely changed shape since I'd walked through the back door 6 hours earlier. Camille was waiting in the kitchen when I came back downstairs, sitting at the table where, exactly one Saturday like this months earlier, we'd probably eaten dinner as a family without either of us saying a word about what was actually happening underneath the surface of our lives. She'd been crying, quietly this time, not the desperate crying from the bedroom earlier. I need you to actually let me explain, she said, not the shouting match from before. I need you to hear the whole thing, even if you hate every part of it, because I think you deserve that much before you decide anything. I sat down across from her. I didn't say anything. I want to be honest that some part of me was still vibrating with the same raw fury from the bedroom, and I didn't trust my own voice not to detonate again the second she said something I couldn't absorb calmly. But I sat, and I let her talk. You asked how long, and I told you 9 months, and that's true, but I don't think that number actually explains anything, so I need to back up, she said, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. It started the spring Priya was gone. I want to be honest that it wasn't some grand seduction. It started with him coming over to fix the garbage disposal, and both of us exhausted, and a bottle of wine, and something that felt, in the actual moment, almost accidental. I told myself the next morning it was a one-time thing, a mistake born out of loneliness and bad judgment, and I meant that. I genuinely meant it. I want to try to explain why it didn't stay a one-time thing. Not to make it sound reasonable, because nothing about it is reasonable, but because I think you deserve to actually understand instead of just knowing the fact of it. That whole year, Brayden, I felt like I was raising Ella mostly alone. I know your job demanded the travel. I'm not saying that to excuse anything. But somewhere in those months, being with Derek even for an hour on a random Tuesday afternoon made me feel like a person again instead of just the one who kept everything running while you were somewhere else. That feeling became something I started organizing my whole week around without ever admitting to myself what I was doing. Every single week, I told myself I was going to end it. I'd have entire days where I meant it completely, where I planned out exactly how I'd tell him it was over. And then Tuesday would come around again and I'd find some reason to let it continue one more week, and then one more after that, until 9 months had gone by and I understood I'd built an entire second structure to my life that I'd stopped being able to imagine actually dismantling. The shame of it is specific, and I want to say it plainly instead of just telling you I felt ashamed, because that word doesn't cover what it actually felt like. There were mornings I couldn't look at Ella's drawings on the fridge, the ones with all 4 of us holding hands, because something about looking at them made my chest go tight in a way I couldn't breathe through. I started avoiding the kitchen some mornings entirely. I told myself it was because I was running late. It wasn't that. I tried to stop it twice, actually stop it, once in the fall and once about 6 weeks ago. Both times I told him it was over, and both times I broke it off myself within a week or 2, and I think some part of me understood, even then, that I'd stopped being able to trust my own decisions about it at all. I hate saying that out loud. It's true anyway. I sat there listening to all of it, feeling something in me shift from the raw, screaming fury of the bedroom into something colder, quieter, and in some ways worse, a settled, total understanding of exactly how deliberate 9 months of this had actually been, dressed up, in her telling, as a series of accidents that somehow kept accidentally repeating themselves every single Tuesday for the better part of a year. I don't know what you want me to say, I said finally, my voice low now instead of shouting, which felt somehow more dangerous than the yelling had. You just told me you tried to stop twice and couldn't. That's not a story about weakness, Camille. That's a story about choosing this, over and over, for 9 months, and choosing me every single day in between without me ever knowing there was a choice happening at all. I know how it sounds, she said. It doesn't just sound like that, I said, and I felt the anger rising back up again, sharper this time, aimed less at the affair itself and more at the specific mechanics of the lie. 9 months of it, dinners and bedtime stories and anniversary dinners I now understood had all been happening alongside this, underneath it, hidden in plain sight in a house I'd been paying for. It is like that. You didn't fall into something once. You built an entire second life and kept it running for 9 months while I was out there thinking we were fine. While Ella was calling him the pancake guy like he was some kind of family friend instead of the man screwing his son's soccer coach's wife. Don't, she said, flinching hard. Don't bring Ella into how you frame this. I'm not bringing her into anything, I said, my voice climbing again despite myself. You brought her into it. You did that the first time you let him make her breakfast. You did that every single Tuesday you let this happen in a house she sleeps in. We were shouting again within minutes, the calm of her monologue dissolving back into the same raw wreckage from the bedroom, both of us saying things sharper and more permanent than anything from the first round, me telling her I didn't know if I could ever look at her the same way again, her telling me that my anger was easy for me because I got to leave every week and she never did, that I'd never once understood what it actually cost her to hold this house together alone as often as she did. Either of us was managing the conversation anymore. It had become, entirely, a collision, every unresolved resentment from 7 years of marriage flooding out alongside the fresh, enormous wound of the affair itself, until neither of us could clearly separate what we were actually fighting about anymore. It ended, finally, somewhere close to midnight, not with resolution but with total exhaustion, both of us sitting at that kitchen table in near silence, spent, the fight burned all the way down to embers with nothing left to say that hadn't already been said, some of it true, some of it cruel, most of it both at once. I need you to leave tonight, I said finally, quietly now, all the shouting gone out of me. Not forever. I don't know what forever looks like. But I can't be in this house with you tonight, and I need you to understand that's not me being dramatic. I mean it. She didn't argue. She packed a bag, quietly, and left for her sister's place a little before 1 in the morning, and I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time afterward, the house entirely silent except for the refrigerator humming, understanding that whatever version of my marriage had existed that morning when I woke up in a Denver hotel room, hoping to make it to Cheyenne on time, was already, completely, gone. I didn't know it yet, sitting there in the wreckage of that night, that the anger wasn't finished with me, that the weeks ahead were going to bring a second, quieter kind of reckoning that would ultimately decide, for good, whether there was anything left of this marriage worth trying to save. I want to be honest that in the days right after that night, some small, Exhausted, part of me actually considered trying to work through it. Camille asked, more than once, for a chance at counseling, at rebuilding, and there were a few weeks that spring where I let myself sit in that possibility without fully committing to it either way, mostly because the idea of upending Ella's entire world felt like its own kind of unbearable weight to carry. What ended it, in the end, wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was smaller and quieter than that. About 3 weeks after the hallway, I ran into Priya at the mailbox, and in the strained, careful conversation that followed, both of us clearly aware of what the other now knew, she mentioned, almost in passing, that this hadn't been the first time Derek had done something like this in their marriage. That there'd been someone else, years earlier, before we'd even moved into the neighborhood, and that she'd forgiven it once already, and had promised herself she'd never do it again if it happened a second time. I don't know why that detail was the one that finally settled things for me, more than anything Camille herself had said. Maybe because it told me something about the specific kind of man my wife had chosen to build a second life with, someone who'd apparently done exactly this before, to someone else, and would likely do it again to whoever came next. Maybe because it made the whole 9 months feel smaller and more sordid than even the raw pain of the hallway had made it feel, less like a story about loneliness and more like a pattern she'd simply stepped into, eyes open, without asking the obvious questions first. I told Camille, about a month after that night, that I wasn't going to try to rebuild it. I want to be honest that this wasn't a calm, composed conversation either. There was one more real fight in the weeks between, sharp and exhausting, before I finally, fully understood that I meant it, that no amount of counseling was going to undo what I'd seen with my own eyes and what she told me at that kitchen table afterward. The divorce moved faster than either of us expected, mostly because either of us had the appetite left for a prolonged fight over things that felt, by then, smaller than what we'd already been through. I kept the house. Ella split her time between us on a schedule that took months to feel less painful than it initially did. I scaled back my travel, not because anyone forced me to, but because standing in that hallway had taught me something about presence I hadn't fully understood before, something I wasn't willing to lose a second time with my own daughter. Derek and Priya separated within the year, not directly because of what happened with Camille, though I suspect it was the final weight on a structure that had already been cracking for longer than any of us on the outside had understood. I heard, secondhand, through the strange small world channels of a neighborhood that had once felt like the best decision we'd ever made, that he moved out of state eventually. I never spoke to him again after the night I told him to get out of my house. I never wanted to. Camille faced her own version of consequence, slower and less visible than anything I could have engineered directly. The friend group we'd built together as a couple splintered, most of them, without ever discussing it out loud, landing on my side of things once the full story came out. Her relationship with her own mother, who'd always adored me, took real time to recover any warmth at all. But the consequence that seemed to land hardest, from what I understood in the occasional conversations we still had to have about Ella, was that she never got the clean resolution she'd been hoping for that night at the kitchen table. No forgiveness, no restored trust, just the long, undramatic work of rebuilding a version of herself that could look her own daughter in the eye without the specific weight of what she'd chosen sitting behind every ordinary moment between them. I want to stop here for a second, because I think this is worth saying plainly. I spent a long time turning over my own part in the years before that Tuesday, not to excuse what Camille did, because nothing excuses what I walked in on, but because I don't think it's honest to tell this story as though I arrived in that hallway a perfect, blameless witness to someone else's failure. I threw myself into work for years in a way that left real distance in our marriage, distance I mistook for a manageable trade-off instead of a genuine cost. That distance didn't make what she did inevitable. But I understood, sitting with it honestly in the months that followed, that I had built exactly the kind of marriage where loneliness could accumulate for 2 years without either of us ever naming it out loud, and that the explosion in that bedroom, as devastating as it was, had been building on both sides for far longer than 9 months. I moved through the year that followed in stages that didn't announce themselves clearly until I was already past each one. Rage first, sharp and constant, the kind that made ordinary tasks feel like they required more effort than they should have. Then something flatter, months where I mostly just functioned, worked, picked Ella up from preschool, didn't examine much of anything too closely because I didn't have the capacity left to. And then, slowly, without my noticing the exact day it started, something steadier began to settle in underneath all of it. I started sleeping through the night again sometime the following spring. I remember waking up on an ordinary Thursday and realizing I'd slept 8 full hours without once replaying the sound Camille made when she saw me standing in that doorway, a sound I'd carried with me, involuntarily, almost every night for the better part of a year. I could have stayed angry indefinitely. Some days I think I still had every right to. I chose something quieter instead, eventually, more out of simple exhaustion at first than any real wisdom. And only later did that choice start to feel like something closer to strength than surrender. I wasn't the same man who'd walked in through that back door believing his cancelled flight was the best break of his week. I was quieter now, steadier with Ella, less willing to let work quietly consume the space that actually belonged to the people in front of me. I'd become someone who understood, in a way I hadn't before, exactly how much presence costs, and exactly how much it costs to lose it. The most painful detail in this story isn't the bedroom itself, or even the 9-month timeline Camille finally laid out at the kitchen table. It's the detail about Derek, the fact that this wasn't his first time doing exactly this to a marriage, that Priya had forgiven the same pattern once already years before Camille ever stepped into it. That detail reframes the whole story in a way the raw confrontation scenes can't. It wasn't only a marriage that failed under the weight of distance and loneliness. It was also, separately, a man who'd built a repeatable method for exploiting exactly that kind of loneliness in more than one household, and no one in either marriage saw the pattern clearly enough, early enough, to interrupt it. There's a broader pattern worth naming here too. Brayden's retreat into work and Camille's slow drift toward Derek were not opposite failures so much as two different responses to the same unaddressed distance. His response was to escape into something he could measure and control. Hers was to seek out feelings seen somewhere else entirely. Neither justifies the other. But together they explain how a genuinely loving marriage, built on real affection and real effort in its early years, can hollow out from the inside over time without either partner ever consciously deciding to let it fail. What the full war confrontation itself reveals, underneath all the shouting, is that raw honesty delivered entirely through anger rarely resolves anything cleanly. It exposes truth. But exposure and repair aren't the same thing. Both of them said things that night that were true and things that were simply cruel, tangled together in a way either of them could fully separate even months later. The real turning point wasn't the fight itself. It was the quiet, unglamorous weeks afterward, when Brayden had to decide, without the adrenaline of that first night carrying him, whether what he'd learned about both his marriage and himself made staying possible at all. I think about the garage door more than almost anything else from that day, the fact that it was already up when I pulled in, a small, ordinary detail I registered and dismissed in the space of a single second, not understanding yet that it was the first piece of evidence in a story I was about to walk directly into. It's strange what your mind keeps and what it lets go. I've forgotten entire arguments from that year. I still remember the garage door. If there's a warning sign worth naming honestly, it's this: the small, easily explained details rarely stay small. A 4-year-old's offhand comment about pancakes, a new running habit, a phone that never leaves someone's side, none of it proves anything on its own, and that's exactly why it's so easy to let each piece pass without comment. Pay attention to the pattern, not just each individual piece. I don't know what I'd tell someone standing where I stood in that hallway, watching their entire life rearrange itself in real time. Maybe just this: the anger you feel in that first unbearable minute is honest, and you don't owe anyone composure while you're still bleeding. But give yourself the weeks afterward too, the quiet ones, because that's usually where the real decision actually gets made.